I want you to picture something. You're 62 years old, and you're standing in a parking lot outside a manufacturing plant you've worked at for 34 years, holding a cardboard box with a desk fan and a coffee mug and a photo of your kids from about 15 years ago. And a security guard who used to wave you through the gate every single morning is now walking you off the property because the company that employed your whole adult life just got bought out by a private equity firm and decided your entire department was, in the language of the termination letter, no longer aligned with operational efficiency targets. That's not a hypothetical for me. That happened on a Thursday afternoon in April, and I'm the man it happened to. My name is Frank Doyle. I'm 62 years old, and 18 months ago, I lost the only job I'd had since I was 28, with less than $4,000 in actual savings to my name, no pension worth mentioning, and a job market that, it turns out, has very little use for a 62-year-old maintenance supervisor, no matter how good he is at his job. Today I live in a city called Davao on the southern island of Mindanao in the Philippines, and I want to tell you exactly how a laid-off factory man from Scranton, Pennsylvania, with nothing saved, ended up building a life for himself on the other side of the planet. I'll back up because none of this makes sense without the 34 years that came before it. I started at that plant, a company that made industrial fasteners, bolts, screws, the unglamorous hardware that holds half the machines in this country together, right out of a 2-year technical program. I worked my way from the floor to a supervisor role over about a decade, and I stayed in that supervisor role for the next 2.5 decades because, frankly, it paid the bills and I was good at it, and moving up further would have meant more politics and less actual work, and I've always preferred work to politics. My wife Denise and I got married when I was 25. We had 2 kids, Danny and Christine, and for a long while things were about as ordinary and fine as any marriage gets. Then, about 11 years ago, the plant went through its first big round of cutbacks, and my hours and my pay both took a hit that lasted the better part of 2 years before things stabilized. Denise and I made it through, technically, but something in the marriage didn't fully recover the way the paycheck eventually did. She left about 3 years after that. Not dramatically, just a slow unwinding that ended with her moving into her sister's place and, a year later, filing for divorce. I don't blame her entirely, and I don't blame myself entirely either. Money trouble finds the cracks in a marriage that were probably already there, and ours had a few. The divorce settlement, combined with helping Danny through a rough stretch of community college, and then helping Christine with her wedding a few years after that, ate through what modest savings I'd built up. I told myself, the way a lot of men my age tell themselves, that I still had time. I was in my 50s. I had a stable job. I'd catch up eventually. And then the plant got bought out, and 18 months of catching up disappeared in one afternoon in a parking lot with a cardboard box. The first few months after the layoff, I did what you'd expect. I applied for everything even remotely related to my skill set within a 2-hour drive of Scranton. I got exactly 2 interviews out of roughly 90 applications, and both of those went nowhere. And at the second one, a younger hiring manager, maybe 40, actually said to me, not unkindly but plainly, "Frank, I'll be honest, we're looking for someone who's going to be with us for the next 20 years, and I'm not sure that's realistic here." I didn't have a good answer for that. I still don't, really, except to say that it stung in a way I wasn't prepared for. Unemployment ran out. My severance, 4 weeks' pay after 34 years, ran out faster than that. I started picking up whatever work I could find, some handyman jobs for neighbors, a few weeks helping a buddy's landscaping crew that about wrecked my knees, and I watched my remaining savings, already thin, get thinner every single month. I was 62 years old, technically eligible for early Social Security, And the math on that alone, once I actually sat down and ran the numbers, was not a math that worked in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Not with rent, not with a car payment, not with the price of groceries these days. There was one interview about 6 months into the search that I still think about more than the others. It was for a maintenance coordinator role at a warehouse about 40 minutes outside the city, a job that was, on paper, close to exactly what I'd been doing for the past decade. I drove out there in my one good sport coat, went through 2 rounds with a plant manager who seemed genuinely impressed by my resume, and walked out feeling for the first time in months like maybe the math was going to work out after all. I didn't hear back for 3 weeks, and when I finally called to check, the woman in HR was kind about it, apologetic even, and told me they'd gone with a candidate who brought a longer runway to the role. I understood exactly what that meant, and I sat in my car in that warehouse parking lot for a good 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive home. I want to be honest about what those months felt like, because I think men my generation aren't great at talking about this part. I felt useless. Not sad exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but useless in a specific way. The way a tool feels useless once nobody needs the job it was built for anymore. I'd worked since I was 17. I didn't know how to be a person who wasn't working. And every rejection letter, every polite dismissal from some manager half my age, made that feeling worse instead of better. It was my old coworker, Ray Kaminsky, who planted the seed that eventually changed everything. Ray had worked the line right alongside me for almost 20 years before he retired out early, about 4 years ahead of the layoffs, on a modest pension and Social Security that, by his own account, wouldn't have stretched far in Pennsylvania at all. I ran into him at a diner about 5 months after I lost my job, and when he asked how I was holding up, I gave him the honest, ugly version instead of the polished one. Ray listened, and then he told me something I hadn't expected. He'd been living in the Philippines for the past 3 years, in a city on the southern island of Mindanao called Davao, and he was only back in Scranton for a few weeks to help his sister move. He pulled out his phone right there in the diner booth and showed me photos. A modest but comfortable house with actual space around it. A view from what he called his favorite local spot, a park with an enormous eagle sanctuary. A group of guys, all around our age, gathered around a table playing dominoes outside a small neighborhood store. "Frank," he said, "my whole Social Security check covers my life down there, with room to spare. I own a car. I go out to eat more than I ever did back here. And people actually look you in the eye when they talk to you." I remember thinking at the time that it sounded like exactly the kind of thing a man says right before he tries to sell you something. But Ray wasn't selling anything. He just kept eating his eggs and answering my questions like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. I didn't do anything about it for another 2 months. Pride mostly, and a healthy dose of skepticism. But the math kept nagging at me, the way math does when you're a man who spent 3 decades responsible for keeping a maintenance budget on track down to the dollar. I started actually researching it, quietly, the way you'd research anything you weren't sure you'd follow through on. Cost of living, visa requirements. There's a retirement visa available to foreigners over 50 who can show a modest amount in savings or a qualifying pension. And even with what little I had left, I found I could actually qualify. I read expat forums late into the night for weeks. I watched videos of retired Americans living all over the country, Manila, Cebu, smaller towns I'd never heard of. And one thing kept coming up whenever anyone talked about Davao specifically, on the southern island of Mindanao. People described it as orderly, safe, clean by the standards of a big Southeast Asian city, without the crush of tourists you'd find in some of the more famous islands further north. It's the kind of place that doesn't get talked about as much in the travel shows, which, once I looked into it, seemed to me like a point in its favor rather than against it. I called Ray back after about 2.5 months of quiet research and told him I was seriously considering it. He didn't act surprised. He just said, "Come see it yourself before you decide anything permanent. I'll show you around." So I did something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember, which is buy a plane ticket for myself, alone, to a place I'd never been, with money I genuinely could not afford to lose if the trip turned out to be a mistake. I told my kids I was going to visit an old work friend overseas. That was technically true, if a little short on detail. Danny, my son, who has always run a little more practical and a little more worried than his sister, asked a lot of pointed questions about where exactly overseas meant, and when I told him, there was a pause on the line long enough that I had to check the call hadn't dropped. "Dad, that's really far away." "It is. You've never even really traveled." "There's a first time for everything, Danny." He didn't push much further, but I could tell it worried him more than he said out loud. The flight was long, the kind of long that gives you far too much time to sit with your own doubts. I landed in Manila first, spent one disoriented night there, getting hit by the heat and the noise, the way every American landing in that airport for the first time seems to get hit, and then took a shorter flight south the next morning to Davao. Ray was waiting for me at the small airport, tanner than I remembered him, and, if I'm honest, looking about 10 years younger than the last time I'd seen him back in Scranton. Davao, from the moment we drove out of that airport, surprised me. I'd braced myself, based on some of what I'd read, for the kind of chaotic traffic and noise I'd seen in videos of Manila. What I got instead was a city that felt, in Ray's words, like the Philippines decided to actually plan itself out. Wide roads, traffic that moved, mostly. A skyline mixing modern buildings with older, low-slung neighborhoods. Ray explained as we drove that the city has a reputation across the country for being unusually well organized and safe. Strict about things like curfews and public smoking, a reputation that, whatever the reasons behind it, had clearly shaped the place into somewhere that felt calmer than I'd expected. Ray put me up in his guest room for the first 4 days, and he took his role as tour guide seriously. We went to a place called the Philippine Eagle Center up in the hills outside the city, where they house and breed the country's national bird, an enormous raptor that's critically endangered and, up close, considerably more intimidating than any bird I'd ever seen in Pennsylvania. We drove out to a mountain called Mount Apo, the tallest peak in the entire country, which loomed over the whole region like a permanent, distant landmark. And one evening, Ray took me to a place downtown called Rojas Avenue, a long strip of open-air food stalls that comes alive after dark, grilling everything from chicken to squid to something called durian, a fruit so famously pungent that most hotels in the country post signs banning it from the premises. I tried the durian against Ray's amused warnings. I will say honestly, it is an experience roughly like eating a rich, sweet custard that has been marinating next to a gym bag. Ray laughed so hard at my face that a woman running the stall next to us started laughing too, and within about 10 minutes, the two of us were sitting with 3 total strangers who'd overheard the whole thing, all of them wanting to know what exactly a Pennsylvania factory man made of Filipino durian. It wasn't an unusual encounter, Ray told me later. It was just Tuesday night in Davao. On my third day, Ray took me out on a short boat ride to an island just off the coast called Samal, maybe 20 minutes across the water, ringed with the kind of white sand beach I'd only ever seen in travel brochures growing up. We spent the afternoon at a modest resort, nothing fancy, and I remember sitting in water so warm and clear it barely felt real, thinking about how 6 months earlier I'd been standing in a Pennsylvania parking lot with a cardboard box, and now I was floating in the Pacific with a retired coworker who'd apparently figured out something about life that I was only just beginning to understand. Ray also happened to mention, almost in passing, that the whole region throws an enormous week-long festival every August called Kadayawan, celebrating the area's harvest and its various tribal cultures, with parades and street dancing and flowers everywhere you look. I wasn't there for it on that first visit, but I filed it away, and when it actually rolled around during my first full year living there, I understood immediately why Ray had brought it up. Entire streets closed down, dancers in elaborate costumes representing tribes I'd never heard of before, moving through downtown for hours. Fruit displays piled higher than I've ever seen fruit piled in my life. I stood in that crowd, 63 years old, a former maintenance supervisor from Scranton, utterly swept up in a celebration that had nothing to do with anything I'd grown up with, and felt, for a moment, entirely and happily out of place in the best possible way. Those first 4 days, I did the math obsessively, the same way I used to run maintenance budgets. Ray's rent for a modest 2-bedroom house in a quiet residential area ran him around 15,000 pesos a month, somewhere around $270. His utilities, food, the occasional night out, all told, he was living comfortably on less than his Social Security check alone provided, with money left over most months. I sat with those numbers on the flight home a week later, and for the first time since that afternoon in the parking lot with the cardboard box, I felt something other than dread when I thought about the years ahead of me. I flew back to Scranton, and I didn't rush the decision, because rushing decisions with money you can't afford to lose is exactly the kind of thing that gets a man in worse trouble than he started with. I spent close to 4 months getting everything in order. I sold my car. I sold most of my furniture to a young couple just starting out who were thrilled to get a decent living room set for next to nothing. I kept a small storage unit for the things that actually mattered, some tools I couldn't bring myself to part with, photos, my father's old watch. And I sat both my kids down, separately, to tell them what I was planning. Christine took it better than I expected. She'd always been the more adventurous of the two, and after I walked her through the actual numbers, the retirement visa, what Ray's life looked like, she said, "Dad, honestly, I think this makes more sense than anything else you could do right now." Danny was harder. He didn't yell. Danny's never been a yeller. But he got quiet in that particular way that worried me more than shouting would have. "You're going to be completely alone over there, Dad. No family, no friends except this one guy from work. What happens if something goes wrong?" I told him I understood the worry and that I'd thought about it plenty myself, but that staying in Scranton with no job, thinning savings, and a landlord who was going to raise my rent again in the spring wasn't exactly a safe plan either. He didn't have a good counter to that, but I could tell he still didn't love it. I flew out on a one-way ticket in September, 63 years old by then, with 2 suitcases and a storage unit full of what remained of my old life back in Pennsylvania. Ray met me at the airport again, and this time he'd already helped me line up a small rental not far from his own place, a modest 1-bedroom with a little concrete porch and a mango tree in the front yard that Ray promised would eventually give me more mangoes than I'd know what to do with. The first month on my own, without Ray hovering as a tour guide every single day, was harder than the visit had led me to expect. I didn't know how to navigate the local jeepneys on my own yet. I got overcharged twice at a market before an older vendor, watching the whole exchange, pulled me aside afterward and quietly told me the fare price so I'd know it next time. I sat on that little concrete porch some evenings, mango tree rustling in the breeze, feeling the specific, heavy kind of alone that comes from being thousands of miles from everyone who's known you longer than a few weeks. What changed things, gradually, was a small neighborhood store, a sari-sari store, run by a woman named Marites, about 200 feet from my front door. I started stopping in most mornings for coffee and a local snack Marites insisted I try, a sweet, dense rice cake called puto that, once I developed a taste for it, became something close to an obsession. Marites had a habit of asking a new question every single morning, not invasive, just curious, about my life back in America, my kids, my work at the plant. And within a couple of weeks, I realized I was actually looking forward to those mornings, the way I used to look forward to the start of a shift, back when the plant still felt like it mattered. It was through Marites that I met the group of men who'd end up becoming, in a way I couldn't have predicted, the closest thing to old work buddies I'd had since the layoff. Most evenings, a handful of retired local men, ranging from maybe 65 to a spry 81, gathered at a plastic table outside Marites' store to play dominoes. Marites introduced me one evening, more or less by shoving a chair in my direction and saying, "Frank, sit, they need a fourth." I did not, at that point, know how to play dominoes with any real skill, and the oldest of the group, a retired jeepney driver named Bert, took visible delight in beating me soundly for the better part of a month before he finally, grudgingly, started teaching me the strategy behind it instead of just letting me lose blindly. Those evenings at the domino table became the spine of my week, the same way, I suppose, my old shift schedule used to be. Bert. A retired teacher named Domingo who spoke the most careful, precise English of anyone I'd met there, having taught it for nearly 40 years. A quieter man named Ramil, younger than the rest of us, maybe 55, who ran a small motorbike repair shop and joined most evenings once he'd closed up. We talked about everything and nothing, the way men do over a game that gives your hands something to do while your mouth does the real work. My knees, same as theirs. My ex-wife, my kids, the plant, 34 years reduced over the course of several evenings into a story that no longer felt quite so much like a wound and more like just a chapter. About 6 months in, I had a scare that tested how much I actually trusted this new life to hold me up if something went seriously wrong. I woke up one night with a sharp pain in my side that got bad enough within an hour that I genuinely considered whether I was having some kind of medical emergency thousands of miles from anyone who shared my last name. I didn't have a car at that point, hadn't needed one, and it was Ramil of all people who I ended up calling at nearly 2 in the morning, more out of desperation than any real plan. He didn't hesitate. He was at my door within 15 minutes on his motorbike, and between the two of us we got a tricycle flagged down, and I was at a hospital downtown within half an hour of that first sharp pain. It turned out to be a kidney stone. Miserable, but not life-threatening, and the emergency room staff moved quickly, ran the scans, got me something for the pain, and had me stabilized and comfortable within a couple of hours. Ramil sat in that waiting room the entire time, texting Bert and Domingo updates, and by the time I was discharged the next morning, all 3 of them had shown up at one point or another to check on me. The whole ordeal, ER visit, scan, medication included, came to a little under 9,000 pesos, somewhere around $160. I lay in my own bed that following afternoon, sore but fine, thinking about how differently that night could have gone if I'd still been living alone in Scranton, with nobody nearby to call at 2 in the morning, and how strange it was that the safety net I'd been most afraid of losing by leaving America had in practice turned out to be sturdier here than it had been back home. About 4 months in, I decided I needed something more than dominoes and a modest fixed income to actually feel like myself again. So I started looking into whether there was any way to put my old skills to use. It turned out there was, though not in the way I expected. A small manufacturing outfit on the edge of the city, making furniture components for export, was looking for someone with real maintenance and equipment experience to consult a few days a week, mostly training their younger staff on preventive maintenance schedules, instead of just fixing things after they broke down, which had apparently been their habit for years. The pay wasn't much by American standards, but it didn't need to be, given how far money already stretched there. And more than the money, it gave me back something I hadn't realized how badly I'd missed. A reason to put on real shoes in the morning and walk somewhere with a purpose. The plant manager, a sharp younger woman named Grace, told me on my first week that half her staff had never once heard the term preventive maintenance used as anything other than a suggestion rather than an actual schedule. I spent the better part of 2 months building out a system not unlike the one I'd run back in Scranton for over 2 decades, and by the time I handed it over fully to her team, breakdowns on their main production line had dropped by something like a third. Grace told me, only half joking, that I'd probably saved the company more in avoided downtime than they were paying me for the whole year. It was the first time since that afternoon in the parking lot that I felt like the 34 years I'd put into that old job hadn't simply evaporated the moment I got walked off the property. About 7 months in, I had my first real test of whether this new life could actually hold up under pressure. And it came in the form of a typhoon that hit the region harder than anything Davao usually sees, since the city sits far enough south that it's typically spared the worst of the storms that hammer the northern islands. This one clipped us anyway. The wind took down half the mango tree in my front yard, and the power went out for the better part of 2 days. I sat through the worst of it not alone, though, because Ramil had knocked on my door the evening before it hit and told me, in his usual understated way, that I should come stay with him and his wife until it passed, since his house was on higher, sturdier ground than my little rental. I did, and I spent 2 days eating meals cooked over a small gas burner, playing endless rounds of dominoes with Ramil's whole extended family by candlelight, and thinking, more than once, about how differently this exact scenario would have played out in Scranton, where I'd have been riding it out completely alone in an empty apartment with a dying phone battery. The bureaucratic side of things wasn't without its own headaches, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think people romanticize this kind of move in a way that does nobody any favors. Sorting out the retirement visa took more back and forth with the immigration office than I expected. Several trips downtown, forms I filled out wrong twice, an afternoon lost entirely to a line that moved so slowly Bert, who'd come along to help translate, eventually just started teaching me a card game to pass the time. It got done eventually, but nobody should go into this thinking the paperwork side of the country runs on American efficiency, because it decidedly does not. Around the 10-month mark, Christine came to visit, the first of my kids to actually see the life I'd built, rather than just hear about it over a spotty video call. She landed nervous, I could tell, the way anyone would after months of me describing a place mostly through second-hand stories and photos of dominoes tables. I took her everywhere: the Eagle Center, Roas Avenue, where she braved the durian and, unlike me, actually liked it, which Ray still brings up every time her name comes up in conversation. She met Marites, who fed her more puto than any human being should reasonably eat in one sitting. She sat in on one full evening of dominoes and watched Bert beat her father soundly, twice, and laughed harder than I'd heard her laugh in years. I also took her out to Samal Island for a day, the same stretch of water Ray had first shown me on my initial visit. And watching her float in that impossibly clear water, completely at ease, 29 years old, and further from her own daily grind than she'd been in longer than she could probably remember, I found myself thinking about how much of my own worry, going in, had been about whether I could take care of myself here. It hadn't fully occurred to me until that afternoon that this place might also end up being somewhere I could take care of my kids in a completely different way than I ever had back home, just by giving them somewhere worth visiting. She came with me one afternoon to the furniture plant, curious about the consulting work I'd described over the phone, and Grace gave her a full tour, walked her through the maintenance schedules I'd built out, showed her the numbers on reduced downtime. Christine, who works in logistics herself back in the States, spent a solid 20 minutes asking Grace detailed operational questions I hadn't even thought to ask myself. And on the drive back to my place, she said, half laughing, "Dad, you basically just built yourself a second career out of nothing." I wouldn't go that far. I would. You should be proud of that. I didn't say much in response, but I felt it, sitting there in the passenger seat of a borrowed car on a road in Mindanao, in a way I hadn't let myself feel it while it was actually happening. On her last night, sitting on my little concrete porch under what remained of the mango tree, she said something that stuck with me. "Dad, I was worried you were running away from everything that went wrong back home." I asked her what she thought now. She was quiet for a second, then said, "Now I think maybe you just found somewhere that actually wanted you around." I didn't have a clever response to that. I just sat there with her in the warm dark and let it settle. Danny came about 4 months after that, more skeptical going in, true to form, with a list of practical questions he'd clearly been saving up. He wanted to know about the healthcare situation in detail, since that had been one of his biggest worries from the start. I took him to the hospital I'd used myself for the kidney stone earlier that year, a modern private facility downtown, and walked him through what an actual visit had cost me, a fraction of what the same care would have run back in Pennsylvania, with attentive doctors who took the time to explain things properly instead of rushing through a 15-minute appointment slot. He asked about safety, about whether I felt secure walking around at night, and I told him honestly that Davao's reputation for being one of the more orderly, well-policed cities in the country had held up, in my own experience, every single day I'd lived there. I introduced him to Ramil in particular, since I wanted Danny to understand exactly who it was that had shown up at 2 in the morning on a motorbike when I needed him most. The two of them ended up talking shop for the better part of an hour about motorbike engines, since Danny's always had a mechanical streak himself, and by the end of the conversation, Ramil had invited him to come by the repair shop the next morning just to poke around, which Danny did, coming back that afternoon with grease under his fingernails and more genuine enthusiasm than I'd seen out of him in longer than I could remember. That evening, at the domino table, Danny sat in for a few rounds himself, and Bert, predictably, beat him without much effort, though he was gentler about it with my son than he'd ever been with me, teaching him the actual strategy from the very first game instead of making him lose blind the way I had. Watching my son laugh with 3 men he'd known for exactly 1 evening, men who'd become, in less than a year, closer to me than most people I'd worked alongside for 3 decades, did something to loosen a knot in my chest I hadn't fully realized was still there. By the end of his visit, Danny admitted, a little reluctantly, that it wasn't at all what he'd pictured when I first told him where I was going. "I thought you'd be sitting alone in some apartment, Dad, kind of just waiting things out." "And now?" He looked out at Marites' store, at Bert setting up the dominoes for that evening's game, at the whole small, ordinary world I'd built for myself in under 2 years. "Now I think you've got more going on here than you did back home, if I'm being honest." Coming from Danny, who has never once in his life exaggerated anything for effect, that meant more to me than almost anything else said to me that whole year. It's been just over a year and a half now since that parking lot in Scranton, the cardboard box, the security guard walking me out of a building I'd given 34 years to. My son and daughter don't worry about me the way they used to. They call more now than they did when I was 2 hours away by car, which is its own strange kind of irony I still haven't fully worked out. Ray and I still get together most weeks, though these days it's just as likely to be me teaching him something new about the maintenance consulting work as the other way around, since he's started picking up a bit of it himself out of pure boredom in retirement. Grace at the furniture plant asked me a few months back whether I'd consider taking on a second client, a small electronics assembly outfit run by her cousin who'd heard about the maintenance overhaul I'd done and wanted something similar. I said yes without much hesitation, and these days I split my consulting time between the two, which has turned what started as a way to feel useful again into something that actually generates a modest, steady bit of income on top of what my Social Security check already covers on its own. I mention that not to brag, because there's nothing to brag about in a couple of small side contracts, but because 18 months ago, standing in that parking lot, I could not have told you a single thing I still had left to offer anybody. And it turns out that wasn't true. It was just waiting for the right place to be useful in. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this life is perfect, because it isn't, and anyone who tells you a fresh start anywhere is free of frustration is selling you something. The bureaucracy is slow. I miss a real change of season, the specific smell of fall in Pennsylvania that you don't get 9 degrees from the equator. I miss my kids more than I let on most days, and there are still nights I think about that plant, 34 years, and feel a flash of something between anger and grief that probably isn't going anywhere completely. But most mornings now I wake up and walk over to Marites' store for coffee and puto, and I hear about her daughter's schooling, and I know, by name, most of the people I'll pass on that short walk. Most evenings, I'm at a plastic table with Bert and Domingo and Ramil, losing at dominoes more often than I'd like to admit, under a mango tree that's already halfway grown back from the storm. And a few days a week, I put on real shoes and walk to a small furniture plant where a bunch of guys half my age actually want to know what I learned over 3 decades of keeping machines running, which turns out to be worth something here, even if it stopped being worth anything to the company that employed me for most of my life. I'm 63 years old, laid off with nothing saved, and somehow, against every bit of math I ran in that parking lot 18 months ago, I've ended up with more than I had before. Not more money, though the money works better here than it ever did back home. More of something harder to put a name to, a reason to get up, a table full of men who expect me most evenings, a kid's laugh over durian that I still can't believe she actually liked. If there's one thing I'd want another man in a parking lot somewhere, holding his own cardboard box, to take from this, it's that 34 years of being useful to one company doesn't have to be the last useful thing you ever do. Sometimes, what looks like the end of your working life is just the end of one particular version of it. If this story meant something to you, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and subscribe. There are more stories like mine, and I think you'll find them worth your time. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.